Part 12. The Plot Thickens. Greg arrived at Chevalier's at 6 a.m. on Monday morning. Nobody was in. He wanted some quiet time alone, without the hustle and bustle of the busy fashion house. He would like to have spent all day Sunday working on the server, but the backups would have taken too much time. He used his pass to enter the dedicated server room, pulled out some files from his case, and slid onto an office chair behind a 22-inch terminal screen. He had passwords to each of the main system areas under investigation. He pondered whether to start his investigation with the main inventory area or the transport accounts. Eventually, he decided to tackle the inventory. After all, this is where the main man is playing, he thought. James and Angela arrived together at 8 a.m. They entered the building separately in an attempt at keeping their love life outside the auspices of the company. James immediately went into the server room to find Greg. "How's it going?" he asked. "This is some kind of system. Someone's managed to hack in here recently, but I can't quite work out what they've done. I've checked the maintenance reports on the server and the software, and nobody's supposed to have touched this thing in the last month, but someone's been here. I've got to be careful, otherwise the company could find itself without a system," said Greg, still studying the screen. "But we've got a backup," said James, suddenly feeling very unsure. Yes, we've got backups, but they will take 18 hours to load, and nobody will be thanking me." Greg paused. "Or you, if this system goes down for that amount of time. This person has got deep into the system. This isn't the work of an amateur, or if it is, he or she would take up the job full time and work for me." "Shit, I can't let you do this. We'll have to speak to Vince. Can we clone the server?" said James, his brain fizzing. "Sure, we can clone the server. We can hire in an identical server, load the backups, and away we go," replied Greg, smiling. "Right, I'll find Vince, and we'll proceed on that basis," said James, holding the door open to leave. "Just one thing, James." "What's that?" replied James. "Once we get the equipment here, it'll take me another 18 hours to set it up," said Greg. "If you keep digging, what could happen?" said James impatiently. "Anything. I can't tell you for sure. We could lose part of the data, all of the data, or we could get lucky and find the perpetrator and lose nothing at all," said Greg, spinning around in his chair and looking up at James for the first time. "Hold fire, I'll be back," said James hastily, and left to find Vince. Vince was away on business. James caught up with him in Atlanta. "Do whatever you have to do, James. You're the boss in my absence," said Vince seriously. James phoned down to Greg. "Get a list of the items we need, and let's get it here fast." "No, better than that. I'm coming back down now." "I'll be waiting," said Greg, folding his arms. James arrived 2 minutes later, and Greg was sitting, his arms folded. "What are you doing?" said James anxiously. "I'm waiting for you," said Greg amiably. "Well, close down what it is you're doing, and let's get this list of parts sorted," said James exasperatedly. Greg shut down his program editor without saving. Without warning, the images on the screen began to dissolve. Greg panicked and shot across the room and reset the server. Fuck, shit," he stammered. What's happening?" said James. Hold it. "I can't talk right now," said Greg. "Greg?" said James firmly, and even more strongly. "Greg! Somebody's changed the passwords. When I access the inner workings of the software with the legitimate password I was given, it's automatically activated a sleeper program, which is destroying all the data, or the software itself," said Greg, his hands astride the desk, looking anxiously at the terminal. "I'm just waiting to see what happens when the software boots up," he added, without looking up. The two men watched as the software booted, then faded from the screen, leaving the two men staring at an empty screen, save for the operating system logo. The two men stared at each other in disbelief. "What are we going to do now?" said James, staring at his friend intently. "I'm making a list of items I need to replace this server, and you're going to have to get them," said Greg unflinchingly. "Can't we just install the backups onto the system?" said James hopefully. "We may have a virus embedded in the boot sector of the system drive that will recognise the software as soon as we load the backups. This will waste another 36 hours, and I'm sure you're not keen on that," said Greg, still trying to fathom out what had just happened. James phoned Denise and asked her to connect him to Vince. "Vince, we have a problem." James explained the problem to Vince and told him about the backups they had stored at the weekend. 18 hours is a long time, James. Everyone is going to have to be told to keep manual ledgers of their work for the next couple of days till we get this straightened out. Oh, and James, none of this gets outside the business. You understand? I'm cutting short this trip, and I'll be in the office first thing tomorrow, said Vince coolly. See you then, replied James, and hung up. James, is that friend of yours about? Inquired John, as James stepped out of his office and headed down to the server room to see Greg. Greg, you mean? Said James inquisitively. Yes, your computer expert, replied John, looking into James's eyes. Do you need him for something? Said James, a little taken aback. Yes, my screen's gone dead again, and that's the second time this week, and I wondered if he could fix it for me. My brain's a complete desert when it comes to computers. John laughed. That's a first. You're pretty nimble with everything else and quick to tell us, thought James. Apparently there's a problem with the main computer, and it won't come back on for about 24 hours, said James. Oh dear, said John, and continued. And I've just run out of ink. He laughed and walked back down the corridor. James sighed and made his way back down to Greg. It took the rest of the day to acquire the replacement server. James made his apologies to Angela and told her he'd catch up with her later. You've got my key, so let yourself in, he cooed as he leaned across and kissed her ear. What's going on, James? Said Angela. Oh, we need some information from the computer system and there's a problem. James hesitated and added, An electrical fault has caused the server to crash. Angela felt uneasy. She could read James like a book. She knew he wasn't telling her the full story, and in her mind there was no logical reason for him to lie. She tried to ignore her unease and let him leave without further query, but found it impossible to let the issue rest. By the time she left that night, she had become convinced that James had a hidden agenda. She was also convinced that his agenda reflected badly on her. She wouldn't be going to James's house that night. James and Greg arrived at James's house at 8. There was no sign of Angela's car. James thought it strange, but was too focused on the problem at hand to pay too much attention to his thoughts. He opened the door and stepped in. He noticed the doors to the large hallway cabinet were open and the contents strewn across the floor. Geez, he exclaimed in disbelief. The house was upside down. Every room had been ransacked. The thieves got in here, shouted Greg, having found the point of entry. The French doors have been forced, he added, beckoning James to the rear of the lounge. I'm not sure anything's missing. My television, music centre, DVD. He paused. It's all still here. James went from room to room, checking on whether anything significant had been stolen. Nothing major has been stolen, he called out to Greg. The drives, said Greg. Both men made for the kitchen. The kitchen cabinet kickboards had not been moved, but the men prized them off anxiously. The drives were still where they had left them. I'll call the police, said James. In that case, I'll take these back to work, replied Greg. No, under the circumstances, just wait. We'll go back together. If this has anything to do with the drives, I think we should stick together, said James firmly. James made a coffee and both men waited for the police. James? Said Greg nervously. Yes, replied James. I don't know how to say this without upsetting you, and I don't want you to feel that I'm pointing any fingers. He paused. What? Said James. Well, before the system crashed, I was able to ascertain that the server was accessed and altered by a terminal on your floor. What do you mean? What are you saying? Said James impatiently. You're not going to like this, old friend. It was Angela's terminal, said Greg quietly, and looking over his coffee cup, trying to gauge his friend's reaction. There was a silence as James digested the information. That doesn't prove... No, it proves nothing, said Greg, interjecting. All it proves is that Angela's terminal was used to gain high-level access to the server in order to alter some coding. It doesn't mean she did it. Someone else could have coded the alterations. James was quiet, deep in thought. He would not and could not believe Angela had any part to play in all of this. Nevertheless, he would have to be careful. And where was Angela? Why hadn't she come home? He said nothing to Greg and remained deep in thought for the next several minutes. Keep this to yourself, said James, when the silence was finally broken. The phone rang at Riley's. At first, Miles didn't hear it, and it rang for a long time before he answered. It was Pat. Miles pulled the door shut between the bar and the hallway leading to Pat's apartment and wrapped himself in the curtain hanging down from the staircase, which separated the hallway from the understairs area where the phone was sited, in an attempt to muffle the sound emanating from the bar. "Pat, Pat!" he gasped. How good to hear from you. How are you?" The words gushed from his lips. "I'm doing good, son. Just fine. How's the bar going? You took a long time answering. I thought you might have packed it in," said Pat flatly. No, not at all. I was sweeping up outside and didn't hear the phone," he lied, still conscious of the noise from the music in the bar leaking into the telephone. "Good that you're keeping everything squared up and we're still in business," said Pat gratefully. "Oh, yes, we're in business all right. Are you coming back, Pat?" "Well, son, I feel very comfortable with my family around me. I'm still having dreams, you know, kind of daydreaming about Claire." He paused, and Miles could feel Pat's pain. "It's her skin, you know. A woman's beauty is in her skin. Claire had such beautiful skin." Pat went quiet. "Pat, you still there? Are you okay?" asked Miles, feeling concerned. "Yes, son, I'm here, just thinking. Look, I'll call you when I'm ready to come back. Good to talk, and thanks for keeping our dream alive. See you soon. Bye," said Pat. "Bye, Pat. Take care," said Miles, but Pat had already gone. Miles puffed out his cheeks and stood for a few seconds. He felt bad, but the bar was working so well. He shook his head and hoped that things would work out when Pat got back. Miles had barely walked back into the bar when the phone rang again. This time he heard it, and believing it might be Pat again, he drew back the curtain, picked up the receiver, and wrapped the curtain around his head. "Riley's, how can I help?" he said. "It's me," said James. "Oh," said Miles, relieved as he unwrapped his head from the curtain. "You don't sound too happy to hear from me," said James. No, it's not that. My head was wrapped up in a curtain. Never mind. What can I do for you?" asked Miles. James paused as he imagined Miles wrapped in a curtain and wondered what Miles could be up to. He decided not to ask. "I need some help, Miles." James briefly explained what had happened and asked whether Miles could find out whether any of Riley's boys would be prepared to help out as security at Chevalier's until Greg straightened out the computer systems. "I'm on it. I'm sure someone will help," said Miles excitedly. "I'll make it worth their while," said James firmly.